Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. This is a lecture on cognitive estrangement, trying to understand the heart of science fiction. So, science fiction has a long history of trying to come up with definitions for itself, and it hasn't worked very well. But one idea that has become central to the literature since the 1970s is the idea of cognitive estrangement. So this concept came from a theorist called Darko Suvin. He is Croatian, although most of his work has been done in the United Kingdom and the United States. He was born in 1934 and is still kicking around today. He really made the first major academic contribution to science fiction. So we're talking the late 60s, early 70s. Science fiction as an academic category gets its first footwork. Now that might seem strange because many people will date science fiction back to Frankenstein in 1818 and even further back than that. So it seems like an odd date to be defining science fiction as an academic category in the 1970s. But others really didn't have an idea of what science fiction was until Darko Suvin came around. The name really came about in the 1930s with Gernsback, who was editor of the Amazing Stories journal, which published what he called scientific fiction, and only later, after about a decade, came to call science fiction. So what science fiction is still, again, has a long history of trying to come to a definition, and we get the first attempt and the most major attempt in the 1970s with Darko Suvin. The primary work where he goes through science fiction history and defends his definition is The Metamorphosis of Science Fiction, which was published in 1979, has been recently republished with some additional essays. It's a fantastic read, and I recommend that you read that book. Darko Suvin was also a founder and co-editor of Science Fiction Studies, which is the first academic journal about science fiction. There are about a half a dozen academic journals now focused on science fiction. So if you like science fiction, you thought about a career in graduate school, then that might be an option for you to go into. Okay. So Suvin says that science fiction is the literature of cognitive estrangement. And we'll talk a little bit about what we mean here by cognitive estrangement, but just to give an idea, he wants to focus on this idea of estrangement. And he says if we think about all of literature on a spectrum, and on one end is absolute recreation of the world. So here is someone who's trying to write a story that is the mirror image of the world. So we might think of Dickens' Hard Times, where Charles Dickens is trying to explain what life is like for the poor at the turn of the century under capitalism. That might be an example of an absolute recreation of the world. I don't know that we would necessarily include something like biographies, but anything fictional after that we would probably consider as to be this one end of the stream, one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum is the exclusive interest in the novum, or strange newness. And we'll talk a little bit about what the novum is in a minute, but just to give you an idea about this would be the short story R.U.R. In 1920 by Karol Sipek, who's Polish, I believe, could be Croatian, I'm sorry. And that's where we get the word robot from. And so here, the story is focused on this idea of the robot and everything derives from that. For Suvin, even though science fiction doesn't really get its start until the 20th century, he traces out a long history that begins in 125 AD with Lucian, who writes sort of a utopian critique of the world. We might push that back a little bit further, although I don't think Suvin would count Plato's Republic as fictional, so it doesn't really get into this category. And as I'll state later on, for Suvin, Utopia is a brand of science fiction, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of Utopia as well. But everything before the 20th century for Suvin is the prehistory of science fiction. So science fiction only really gets its start in the 20th century. Now, to understand that, we want to think about what the novum is. And this is a term that Suvin gets from the Marxist scholar Ernst Bloch, who wrote The Principle of Hope. It's a 3-volume work on the concept of hope. But in this 3-volume work, he comes up with this idea of the novum, which is the unexpectedly new, which pushes humanity out of its present to the not yet realized. Pushes humanity out of the present to the not yet realized. So a lot of us, when we think about science fiction, we think about the future. And that's certainly caught up into this, but anything can really push us out of the present into what's not yet realized. Whether it's a science fiction story written about the day today right now, or something written about the future, or even something that might be written about the past. We have this idea that there's something that's new here that we would never have seen before that pushes us past the present to the not yet realized. So in the story that I just mentioned, RUR, robots would be something that's new, and that pushes past the present to something that we haven't really realized, particularly in 1920, a robot. We're a little closer today, but we don't have anything like what we would imagine a robot would be. For Suvin, anything can be the novum. So it could be a person, a place, a thing. It could be a whole different world. So Suvin talks about Thomas More's Utopia as a novum. So if you remember Thomas More's Utopia, it's an island off in the sea somewhere. No one really knows how to get there. But here's a new world that Thomas More really explains something different. And it's trying to push us into something that we haven't yet realized. Now, again, Suvin doesn't believe science fiction really began until the 20th century. So Thomas More's Utopia is not science fiction by his category, but it is a prelude to science fiction. For Suvin, then, science fiction must be wedded because the novum must be wedded to a value system of the laboring, the dominated, and the exploited. So it's a progressive, category of fiction. So anything that's not progressive is not, on Suvin's understanding, really going to be science fiction. Now, he has some discussion in Metamorphoses that he says what counts as progressive depends on the author. And so he takes account that some people who are conservative leaning might write something that to them is liberating, but for the laboring, the dominated, and exploited might not be liberating. And that still counts for science fiction to some extent. So he sort of waffles a little bit. He tries to not play politics, but there is a very strong commitment to those who are dominated and exploited. If you're taking my summer class, or if you're taking my philosophy of Brave New Philosophies class, you'll know that we're focused on issues of social identity and oppression. So obviously science fiction for Suvin is going to connect to those kinds of ideas. Okay, so let's talk about estrangement a little bit more. So Bertolt Brecht is a playwright and a critic from the early 20th century. And he says that a representation which estranges us is one which allows us to recognize its subject, but at the same time makes it seem unfamiliar. So if you think about Thomas More's Utopia, just to go back to that because you're probably familiar with it, we have a representation of something that looks like England, right? The island is about the size of England, but which is helping us to see the world differently, see England differently, because it presents to us something that's unfamiliar. So there are scenes in Thomas More's Utopia where they use gold to make toilets, not because they're rich, but because they have no other use for gold. So estrangement is both an attitude and a device. So for Suvin, Thomas More would have a certain kind of attitude in which he's trying to estrange us from the everyday world, and he's using this device of the island to help make that change for us. So we're not looking at just a mirror. We're looking for some kind of aspect of the supreme good. So again, we have that sense of political progressiveness here. Of course, Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas would talk about the supreme good. That idea comes from their philosophy, and many people do not associate them with sort of progressive politics. But that might be something that we have to rethink. In any case, the idea of the supreme good is something that pushes us towards looking at the world in a different way. And so it takes what is imaginary and develops it with a scientific rigor. So we're always going to come back to this rigorousness of science and using that to understand the imaginary. So the reason that Thomas More's Utopia is not science fiction is that it doesn't have a scientific rigor to it, even though it's imaginary. So we've got the first half of the definition, right? A literature of cognitive estrangement. Cognition, then, is a reflective approach of and on reality. So we're reflecting we're reflective of reality, and we're reflecting on reality. So again, to refer to Thomas More's Utopia, we have a reflection of reality in terms of how the island itself is shaped and similar size to England, but we're also reflecting on reality. And so for Suvin, this is a creative approach tending toward a dynamic transformation of reality. And of course, Thomas More, on most interpretations of Utopia, is trying to push England into a transformation of reality. Most science fiction, according to Suvin, if we buy this understanding, is critical of reality and trying to push us toward this kind of dynamic transformation. Science here does not have to be the natural sciences, though. We can also think about the social sciences, so psychology, sociology, and in fact, for Suvin, most science fiction is based on the social sciences, not the natural sciences. For those of us today who are science fiction aficionados, we think of hard science fiction as based in the natural sciences. So cognition is not myth, it's not folktale, it's not fantasy. It's none of these things because these things are not critical. And we'll come back to fairy tale at the end of this, but I want to move on here because time is running short for this lecture. So Suvin's final definition is that science fiction is a literary genre whose necessary and sufficient conditions are the presence and interaction of estrangement and cognition, and whose main formal device is an imaginative framework alternative to the author's empirical environment. So that's the novum there, right? So the science fiction is going to be defined relative to the author's life and times, right? We have airplanes now, so that's not science fictional for me, but it might have been science fictional to someone in 1818. Utopia for Suvin is an aspect of science fiction. It's progressive, and the environment or the new world serves as a novum, and we've seen that with the discussion of Thomas More's Utopia. Most Utopia written today is of the science fiction category. Now, Suvin does not think that space opera is science fiction, and this goes against most of our thoughts about what science fiction is. So most of us would think of Star Wars as science fiction, but Suvin says it's not, and he talks specifically about the hero princess monster triangle, which you see there in the original poster for Star Wars. For Suvin, space opera or fantasy fairy tale is suicide for science fiction, because the fairy tale is an escape from the present, but closed off from critique, closed off from cognitive possibilities. So it might be a debate that we have online about whether Star Wars is actually closed off to cognitive possibilities. Imagination in the space opera and in the fairy tale is an end in itself and not something that underlies an attempt to understand reality. So does Star Wars help us to understand reality? A philosopher that follows after Suvin is a guy named Carl Friedman. We are not reading him. But I think he takes Suvin's idea a little bit too far, because he says that every piece of fiction is science fiction, because every piece of fiction is in some sense estrangement. We can talk about that at some point if you want. Feel free to ask me questions in the comment section or online. So some criticisms that we might come up against Suvin is that his understanding of science fiction doesn't really cohere with our normal understanding, Star Wars being a primary example. Utopia, dystopia is typically taken to be its own genre and tradition. So to say that utopia is part of science fiction can be problematic. It's dismissive of the cognitive aspects of fantasy, and it doesn't